David didn't have a childhood like other kids. Growing up in his home meant learning to live with the uncertainty and sadness that permeated every corner of the house. His parents, trapped in a destructive cycle of addiction and neglect, couldn't provide the love or stability that a child needs. They had both fallen into the grip of drugs when David was still very young, and from that point on, his life became a daily struggle to survive in an environment full of chaos. Nights in his home were marked by an oppressive silence that was only broken by the erratic whispers of his parents as they wandered around the house in search of their next fix. Days passed slowly, and David often found himself alone, with the responsibility of taking care of himself. The house, disorganized and neglected, reflected the state in which his parents lived, completely disconnected from reality and from their son. As he grew older, David realized that things were not going to get better. His parents, consumed by their addictions, couldn't offer him a future. The few times they spoke to him, it was with vacant stares or incoherent words. David felt invisible, a spectator in his own life, watching as everything around him crumbled. At 16, after a long period of introspection, David decided he needed to take control of his destiny. His home was no longer a safe place, and the future awaiting him there was just an extension of the emptiness and loneliness he already felt. So, one night, after making sure his parents were asleep following another night of consumption, David packed the little he had: a change of clothes, some childhood photos, and an old book that had been his only companion for years. That same night, with his heart racing and a lump in his throat, David left his home. He had no plan or place to go, but he knew staying wasn't an option. The city streets were silent, illuminated only by the dim light of street lamps. Every step he took distanced him further from the house that, while it had been his home, had never given him the warmth he needed. When he reached the city, with the first rays of sunlight peeking over the horizon, David realized the magnitude of his decision. Now he was alone, in an unfamiliar place, without money or friends. The city, which during the night seemed to offer hope, during the day appeared cold and distant. The first days in the city were tough. David wandered the streets, looking for a job that would allow him to survive. However, his lack of experience and disheveled appearance made him unattractive to employers. Doors closed one after another, and with each rejection, despair grew inside him. David spent several nights sleeping outdoors, in parks or under bridges, wrapped in the same jacket he had brought from home. Hunger became a constant companion, and his body, growing weaker by the day, began to succumb to exhaustion. Despite everything, David didn't want to go back. Even though the city seemed indifferent to his suffering, he was determined to find a way forward. One afternoon, while resting on a park bench, an older man approached him. It was Don Roberto, an elderly man who had noticed David wandering around the city in recent days. Moved by his situation, Don Roberto decided to offer him an opportunity that could change his life. He told him about Mr. Walker, an elderly man who lived alone in a large house on the outskirts of the city and needed help maintaining it. The pay wasn't much, but it offered shelter and food, something David desperately needed. Without hesitation, David accepted the offer. That same afternoon, Don Roberto took David to Mr. Walker's house. The mansion, which must have been impressive in its time, was now covered in dust and overgrown with weeds. The windows were dirty, and the garden seemed completely abandoned. However, for David, this house represented an opportunity, a new beginning that he so desperately needed. Mr. Walker opened the door with a serious expression. His eyes, which had seen many things in life, scrutinized David from head to toe. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, the old man let him in. The inside of the house was even gloomier than David had imagined. It was filled with antiques, old furniture, and stacks of books in every corner. The heavy, worn curtains barely let in any light, plunging the place into constant dimness. Mr. Walker was not a man of many words. He showed David to his room, a small alcove on the second floor that, though modest, was much better than any place he had slept in recent days. The bed, although old, was clean, and the window overlooked the back garden. For David, that small room represented a refuge, a place where he could begin to rebuild his life. The first days in Mr. Walker's house were challenging. David was not used to living in such a large space filled with ancient objects. The tasks were many, and the old man, though grateful for the help, was quite demanding. However, David didn't complain. He knew he was lucky to have found this job, and he was determined not to waste the opportunity. The work in the house was exhausting. David was responsible for cleaning, organizing, and keeping everything in order. Mr. Walker, for his part, spent most of his time in his study, surrounded by old books and papers. He barely spoke to David, and when he did, it was to give instructions or correct some detail. Despite the difficulty of the work and Mr. Walker's coldness, David began to find a strange peace in that house. Each day, as he cleaned and organized, he felt like he was also putting order into his own life. Days passed, and although his relationship with Mr. Walker remained distant, David began to feel that he had finally found a place he could call home, even if only temporarily. As David grew accustomed to his new life, he also began to notice things about Mr. Walker. The old man, though stern and reserved, was not cruel. There was something in his gaze, a deep sadness that David couldn't quite understand. It was as if Mr. Walker was carrying an invisible burden, something that kept him anchored to the past and distanced him from the joy of the present. David, with his youth and inexperience, didn't fully grasp the complexities of the loneliness and melancholy that seemed to surround Mr. Walker, but he felt a growing curiosity to learn more about him. And although the old man kept an emotional distance, David began to sense that behind that hard and cold facade, there was a story worth hearing. For now, David focused on doing his job well and adapting to this new life. Each day was a struggle to overcome his past and build a better future, and although the path was not easy, for the first time in a long while, he felt he was headed in the right direction. The story of David and Mr. Walker was just beginning, and although neither of them knew it, that encounter would be the start of a transformation that would change their lives forever. From the moment David crossed the threshold of Mr. Walker's house, tension began to pulse in the air. For David, accustomed to the harshness of life on the streets and the coldness of his previous home, adapting to an enclosed space full of objects with history turned out to be more challenging than he had anticipated. Every corner of the house seemed to be laden with memories that weren't his, but that somehow began to influence his mood. The first major conflict arose the day after his arrival. David, with the intention of doing his job as well as possible, decided to start with the cleaning of the main hall. This space, though large and once undoubtedly majestic, was covered with a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The heavy, dark wooden furniture was arranged chaotically, surrounded by boxes full of old objects and yellowed papers. There was a heavy mantle of sadness in that place, as if time had stopped decades ago. David, with a mix of youthful energy and a desire to prove his worth, began moving some furniture to clean underneath them. In his enthusiasm, he decided to move some objects that seemed unnecessary to him into a small adjoining room. An old grandfather clock that no longer worked, a broken vase, and some boxes of papers that seemed to have been forgotten long ago. It was then that Mr. Walker appeared in the doorway of the hall, with a look of barely contained fury. His eyes narrowed, and his face, which was already severe, hardened even more. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked in a harsh voice, barely holding back his anger. David, surprised by the reaction, quickly straightened up, still holding a dust cloth in his hand. "I'm just cleaning, Mr. Walker. I thought these objects were in bad condition, and it would be better to move them to better organize the hall." The old man, however, did not calm down. He slowly walked over to the grandfather clock that David had pushed into the corner and gently caressed it with a trembling hand. "This clock belonged to my grandfather," he said quietly, almost to himself. "And these papers," he gestured towards the boxes, are letters from my daughters, from when they still wrote to me. You have no right to touch anything in this house without my permission." David felt a lump form in his throat. It hadn't been his intention to offend the old man, but Mr. Walker's reaction had taken him by surprise. He tried to apologize, but the words got stuck in his throat. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker. I didn't know," he stammered. But the old man interrupted him with a cutting gesture. "What you don't know is a lot, boy. In this house, everything has its place, and it's not up to you to decide what stays and what goes. Do your job, but don't touch anything else without asking me first." David nodded silently, feeling small and insignificant. As Mr. Walker retreated to his study, David remained motionless in the middle of the hall, feeling as if, in some way, he had failed. After that first confrontation, the relationship between David and Mr. Walker became even more tense. Trying not to make any more mistakes, David began to work more cautiously, asking Mr. Walker about each object before moving or cleaning it. This significantly slowed down his work, but it also gave him the opportunity to learn more about the old man. Mr. Walker had an almost obsessive attachment to the objects that filled his house. Each one seemed to be laden with a memory, a story that, in his mind, connected him to a past that no longer existed. David began to realize that it wasn't just stubbornness or resistance to change that drove the old man to cling to these things, but a deep loneliness. The objects in the house were like anchors for Mr. Walker, tangible reminders of better times, of a life that was once full of love, family, and happiness. The letters from his daughters, the toys he had kept from when his grandchildren were little, even the old and worn furniture, all had a significance beyond their mere physical presence. They were memories of a time when he wasn't alone, when his house was full of voices and laughter. David, who had lived in a home where things lacked sentimental value, where objects were just that, things, began to understand Mr. Walker's pain. He understood that, for the old man, getting rid of anything was like losing a part of himself, a connection to a past that would never return. Despite the constant tensions, David did not lose heart. He decided that instead of confronting Mr. Walker, he would try to find a balance. He began to ask more about the objects before moving them, asking Mr. Walker to tell him their stories. Although at first, the old man was reluctant to talk, slowly, the barriers began to fall. One afternoon, while David was carefully cleaning a shelf full of dusty books, he dared to ask, "Mr. Walker, would you mind telling me about these books? They seem very old." The old man, who was sitting in his usual chair by the window, looked up from his newspaper. For a moment, David thought he would be ignored, but after a long silence, Mr. Walker responded in a soft voice, "My wife, Margaret, and I used to collect old books. Each of these has a story. She loved to read. We would spend hours together in this very room, her reading aloud while I worked at my desk." David listened in silence, nodding slowly. There was no need to say more. The pain in Mr. Walker's voice, though contained, was palpable. David realized that every book, every piece of furniture, every letter was a way of keeping alive the memory of those he had lost. He understood that the transformation of the house could not be a simple cleaning. It had to be a delicate process, one that respected the past while making room for the present. In time, David found a way to work in the house that not only respected Mr. Walker's wishes, but also began to ease the tension between them. Each day, he dedicated time to organizing a small part of the house, always consulting the old man before moving anything. This slow and considered approach not only avoided new conflicts, but also allowed David to learn more about Mr. Walker's life. In their conversations, David discovered that Mr. Walker had been a successful businessman in his youth. He had traveled the world, met his wife on one of those trips, and together they had built a life full of adventures and happiness. However, over time, things changed. Margaret became ill and passed away many years ago, and his daughters, busy with their own lives, gradually drifted away from him. The grandchildren he had adored also grew up and distanced themselves, leaving Mr. Walker alone in a house that had once been full of love. As he listened to these stories, David felt a growing empathy for the old man. He remembered his own loneliness and the feeling of being lost in a world that offered no refuge. Although their experiences were different, they shared a common pain, that of loss and loneliness. As the house transformed, so did the relationship between David and Mr. Walker. Although the old man remained reserved and unexpressive, he began to trust David more. Discussions about the objects in the house became less frequent, and conversations, though still sparse, began to flow more naturally. One day, while David was tidying up the kitchen, he found a box of old photos in one of the cabinets. Without thinking too much about it, he carried the box into the living room and placed it on the table in front of Mr. Walker. "Mr. Walker, I found these photos in the kitchen. I thought you might like to see them," David said, watching the old man cautiously. Mr. Walker, who was reading a book, looked up and saw the box. For a moment, his face hardened, but then, with a deep sigh, he closed the book and leaned toward the box. "Those photos," he murmured as he took them out one by one. "They're from when the girls were little." David sat quietly, allowing Mr. Walker to immerse himself in his memories. The old man began to speak, more to himself than to David, recalling happy moments with his family, trips they had taken together, birthday parties, and days in the park. His voice, usually harsh, softened as he spoke of those times. For the first time, David saw Mr. Walker not as a stern and distant man, but as someone who had loved deeply and who had lost everything that had once been important to him. The loneliness that surrounded him was not just the result of his age or the distance of his family, but of a heart that had been wounded so many times that it had closed off to protect itself. As the months passed, the transformation of the house became evident. The dust and cobwebs disappeared, the furniture was rearranged more harmoniously, and light began to filter through the windows that David had meticulously cleaned. But more important than the physical change was the change in the atmosphere. The house, which had once felt oppressive and laden with sadness, began to have a new energy, an air of renewal. Mr. Walker, though still distant, began to show small gestures of appreciation toward David. Sometimes he would offer him a cup of tea in the afternoon or invite him to sit with him while he watched the news. These moments, though brief, were significant for both of them. David, who had arrived at the house feeling like a stranger, began to feel that he belonged in that place, that he was helping not just to clean a house, but to heal a broken heart. The house, which at first had been just a place of work for David, began to become a home. Mr. Walker, for his part, began to depend on David's company more than he wanted to admit. Though he remained reserved, the young man's presence in his life had given him a new reason to get up each morning. David, seeing the change in Mr. Walker and the house, began to understand that his arrival at that place hadn't been just out of necessity. He felt that, in some way, he was meant to be there, to help Mr. Walker reconnect with the world, to find some peace in his final years. The bond between them, though subtle, began to grow. Through the small gestures and shared conversations, both found in each other something they had lost long ago: companionship and understanding. And though neither of them said it out loud, they knew that their lives were being transformed, just like the house that surrounded them. As the months went by, the relationship between David and Mr. Walker continued to develop, marked by a mix of tensions and discoveries. Despite the positive changes in the house and the growing trust between the two, the old man remained an enigmatic and reserved figure, a man who had suffered deep losses and lived with the weight of the past on his shoulders. Mr. Walker, throughout his life, had experienced both success and tragedy. He was a successful businessman who, together with his wife Margaret, built a life full of meaning. His daughters, Emily and Catherine, grew up in a loving home, surrounded by the best opportunities their parents could provide. However, the death of Margaret, which occurred after a long and painful illness, marked the beginning of a dark period in Mr. Walker's life. After his wife's death, Mr. Walker withdrew from his career and took refuge in the solitude of his home. His daughter's visits became less frequent over time. Emily and Catherine, now adults with their own families and responsibilities, emotionally and physically distanced themselves from their father. unable to understand the abyss of pain into which he had fallen. David, despite his youth, began to perceive the deep sense of loss that permeated every aspect of Mr. Walker's life. The old man rarely spoke of his daughters, and when he did, there was a mixture of pride and sadness in his voice. It was evident that he missed them, but also that he had accepted, in some way, that they were no longer part of his daily life. The daily routine between David and Mr. Walker settled into a series of small rituals that both came to value. David, for his part, had learned to read Mr. Walker's emotions through his behavior. He knew when it was best to leave him alone and when his presence was a silent comfort. One day, however, something in the routine changed. It was a cold autumn afternoon, and David had been in the kitchen preparing tea, as he did every afternoon. Mr. Walker was in his study, going through some old papers. Suddenly, David heard a dull thud coming from the study, followed by an unsettling silence. David's heart skipped a beat, and he ran towards the room. What he found froze his blood. Mr. Walker lay on the floor, motionless. His face was pale, and his breathing was irregular. David, unable to fully process what he was seeing, reacted instinctively. He ran to get the phone and, with trembling hands, dialed the emergency number. "Please, help me. My boss has collapsed. I think he's had a stroke," David said, trying to stay calm while describing the situation to the operator. They told him that an ambulance was on its way, but while they waited, time seemed to stand still. David knelt beside Mr. Walker, gently holding his hand. The old man was unconscious, but David couldn't stop talking to him as if his words could keep him clinging to life. "Mr. Walker, don't leave me. Please, don't give up," he whispered, feeling tears begin to blur his vision. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, the ambulance arrived. The paramedics quickly entered the house, taking control of the situation. David was moved aside as the professionals attended to Mr. Walker, preparing him to be transported to the hospital. Once the ambulance left, David was left alone in the house. The void left by Mr. Walker's departure was palpable. He knew the next thing he had to do was inform the old man's daughters. Although Mr. Walker rarely spoke of them, David knew their names and where they lived. He was aware that they hadn't been close to their father in a long time, but this was an emergency, and they needed to know what was happening. David went to Mr. Walker's study, looking for the old address book where he knew the old man kept all his contacts. Finding it, he began to search for the phone numbers of Emily and Catherine, his daughters. His hand trembled as he dialed the first number. The first call was to Emily, the eldest daughter. The voice on the other end of the phone was distant, as if she didn't recognize the number calling. "Hello?" Emily answered, in a neutral tone. "Hello, my name is David. I'm your father, Mr. Walker's caregiver," David began, trying to find the right words. "Your father has had a stroke. He's in the hospital right now. I thought I should inform you immediately." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by a faint sigh. Is he serious?" Emily asked, and David noticed a hint of concern in her voice. "Yes, he is. The paramedics took him to the hospital, but I don't know his current condition. I think it would be important for you to come." "I will. Thank you for letting me know," Emily replied before hanging up. David stared at the phone for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation on his shoulders. Next, he dialed Catherine's number, the younger daughter. The conversation was similar, with Catherine showing a bit more surprise than her sister, but both promised to get to the hospital as soon as possible. David arrived at the hospital before Mr. Walker's daughters. The doctors told him that Mr. Walker was in critical condition and that the next few moments would be crucial. Sitting in the waiting room, David felt a mix of anxiety and guilt. He couldn't stop thinking that somehow he should have anticipated this, though he knew it was irrational to blame himself for something so unpredictable. As he waited, the images of the past few months flashed through his mind. The shared afternoons, the conversations filled with significant silences, the transformation of the house, and the growing feeling that there was something deeper in his relationship with the old man. Mr. Walker hadn't just been his employer. He had become a father figure, someone who had impacted his life in ways David was just beginning to understand. A couple of hours later, Emily and Catherine arrived at the hospital. Both women, elegantly dressed, seemed out of place in the clinical setting. Upon seeing David, they approached with a mix of urgency and reserve. "Where is our father?" Emily asked, taking the lead. "He's in the intensive care unit," David replied. Standing up, "The doctors said his condition is very delicate. They're doing everything they can to stabilize him." Catherine, who had remained silent until then, looked at David with questioning eyes. "You're David, right? Our father mentioned you once." David nodded, not knowing exactly what to say. He felt that there were so many things he needed to explain to them, but at that moment, the most important thing was to wait for news about Mr. Walker. The hours in the waiting room were tense and long. Emily and Catherine asked a few questions about their father's condition, but otherwise, silence prevailed. David noticed that although the sisters were visibly concerned, there was a palpable distance between them and the situation. It wasn't just concern for their father that affected them. It was also the discomfort of facing a reality they had distanced themselves from for so long. Finally, a doctor came out to speak to them. The doctor's face was serious, and David could see the sadness in his eyes before he even began to speak. "I'm very sorry," the doctor said, addressing Emily and Catherine. "Your father has suffered a massive stroke. We did everything we could, but his body couldn't hold on. He's gone." The impact of the doctor's words hit everyone like a ton of bricks. Emily brought a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob, while Catherine, tears in her eyes, sank into one of the chairs in the waiting room. David, who had been standing the whole time, felt his knees weaken. He leaned against the wall, trying to process what he had just heard. Mr. Walker was dead. The man he had come to respect and, in many ways, to care for was gone. The reality of the loss hit David with an intensity he hadn't anticipated. He knew this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the void he now felt. After the news, Mr. Walker's daughters began to organize what would come next. Decisions had to be made about the funeral, their father's belongings, and what would happen to the house. Emily and Catherine were immersed in grief, but also in a kind of distant responsibility, as if fulfilling these tasks was more of an obligation than a personal farewell. David, though he had no formal role in these decisions, was included in the conversations, partly because he had been the closest to Mr. Walker in his final days. Although Emily and Catherine were grateful for the care David had given their father, they couldn't help but treat him as a stranger. Not because they didn't appreciate him, but because, in their grief, they didn't know how to integrate him into such a familiar and intimate process. Mr. Walker's funeral was simple and solemn. It was held in a small nearby chapel, attended by some friends and acquaintances of the family, along with the few neighbors who still remembered the old man. David stayed in the background during the ceremony, feeling like an intruder at an event that, although deeply meaningful to him, didn't seem entirely his. Emily and Catherine, though visibly affected, remained stoic during the ceremony. For them, this was a goodbye filled with regrets and unexpressed emotions. David, watching them, couldn't help but wonder what they really felt, if there was something more than the formal sadness they showed to the world. After the funeral, everyone returned to Mr. Walker's house for a small reception and to share memories of the old man. However, the house, despite all the changes David had made, now felt emptier than ever. The corners that had once been full of life and memories shared with Mr. Walker were now devoid of his presence, and the silence that filled the space was almost unbearable. David watched in silence as Emily and Catherine spoke with the other guests, smiling politely and accepting condolences with gratitude. But when they were finally alone, the two sisters faced the harsh reality of what came next, the reading of their father's will. After the funeral, Emily and Catherine began organizing the details for the reading of the will. They contacted the family lawyer, the same one who had drafted the document years ago when Mr. Walker's health began to decline. The sisters were anxious to know what their father had decided, although both knew that most of the inheritance would likely be divided between them. David, though he didn't expect anything in particular, felt nervous at the prospect of the will reading. He knew that Mr. Walker had mentioned the possibility of leaving him something, but he had never stopped to think about what that would really mean. For him, the idea of an inheritance wasn't about money or possessions. What mattered was the meaning behind the gesture, the confirmation that his time with Mr. Walker had been valuable and appreciated. The reading of the will was scheduled for the next day at Mr. Walker's house. Emily and Catherine insisted that David be present, since they knew their father had had a special relationship with him. Though the situation was uncomfortable for everyone, there was a sense of inevitability in the air. The will was Mr. Walker's last wish, and everyone had to respect it, no matter what it implied. The night before the will reading, David couldn't sleep. He stayed in the small room that had been his for the past few months, surrounded by the objects that had once belonged to Mr. Walker. He looked around, remembering the many conversations they had had in those same spaces, the moments of shared silence, and the slow but significant transformation they had achieved together. The house, which had once been a reflection of Mr. Walker's pain and loneliness, was now filled with small touches of life, the result of their joint work. However, now it was different. Without Mr. Walker, the house felt like a testament to what had been, but also like a question about what could be. David knew he couldn't just continue his life as if nothing had changed. Mr. Walker's legacy wasn't just a house and some money. It was an opportunity and also a responsibility to do something meaningful, something that truly honored the old man's memory. During the weeks that followed, David began to seriously reflect on what he would do with the house and with his life. Although he had the freedom to sell the property and use the money for any other purpose, that option never really crossed his mind. He knew that the house was much more than just a piece of real estate. It was a place full of stories, of memories, and of the life of a person who had come to mean a lot to him. David spent hours walking through the house, entering each room, examining every object, every piece of furniture, trying to connect with Mr. Walker's spirit and understand what he really should do. During this time, he also began to reread the letters and documents he had found in the house. Among them, he discovered letters from Margaret, Mr. Walker's wife, and notes written by the old man himself, in which he spoke of his dreams and hopes for the future. It was in one of those notes that David found a clue about what he should do. In it, Mr. Walker had written about the loneliness he felt in his final years and how he had dreamed of turning his house into a place where other lonely, elderly people could find comfort and companionship. Mr. Walker hadn't been able to carry out that dream, but David realized that now he had the opportunity to make it a reality. The idea of transforming the house into a home for the elderly began to take shape in David's mind. At first, it seemed like too ambitious a dream. He had no experience managing such a home, and the task seemed monumental. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that this was the way he could honor Mr. Walker while also finding purpose in his own life. The house, as it was, already had the warm and welcoming atmosphere that could provide comfort to elderly people who needed a place to spend their final years with dignity. David also knew that he had something more to offer. His life experience, his empathy, and the lesson he had learned from Mr. Walker about the importance of human connection and companionship. Determined to move forward with the plan, David began to research how he could turn the house into a home for the elderly. He contacted several local organizations dedicated to elder care and attended workshops and seminars on managing homes for the elderly. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that this was what he should do. The process of transforming the house into a home for the elderly was arduous, but David was determined to do it right. He knew he couldn't do it alone, so he began to seek support from the community. To his surprise, he found many people willing to help. Neighbors who had known Mr. Walker, family friends who had heard about the project, and even elder care professionals all wanted to be part of something they felt was special. The house needed some modifications to comply with the regulations for a home for the elderly, and David spared no expense in ensuring that everything was done correctly. He used part of the inheritance to hire architects and builders who could adapt the house to the needs of the future residents. Ramps were installed, the bathrooms were expanded, and common areas were created where the elderly could socialize and spend time together. During this time, David faced multiple challenges. There were days when things didn't go as planned, and doubts began to assail him again. However, Whenever he felt overwhelmed, he remembered Mr. Walker's words and the purpose he had found in this project. He knew he couldn't give up, not after everything he had learned and everything he had been entrusted with. After months of hard work, the day of the opening finally arrived. David had decided to call the place the Walker House in honor of Mr. Walker and the memory of his wife, Margaret. The house, which had been a refuge for Mr. Walker in his final years, would now become a home for those who, like him, needed a place to feel loved and cared for. The inauguration was a small but significant event. It was attended by Mr. Walker's friends and neighbors, as well as Emily and Catherine, who had supported the project from the beginning. Also in attendance were several elderly people who would be the first residents of the home, along with their families, who thanked David for creating such a special place. During the ceremony, David gave a brief speech in which he spoke about the inspiration behind the Walker House and how it had been Mr. Walker's desire to do something meaningful with his home that had led him to undertake this project. He also spoke about his own transformation, how he had arrived at Mr. Walker's house as a lost and directionless young man, and how the time he had spent with the old man had given him a purpose and direction in life. After the speech, everyone toured the house, admiring the renovations and the details that David had personally attended to. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, and many commented on how they felt the house had an air of home, something David had worked hard to achieve. With the opening of the Walker House, David found a new purpose in his life. He was no longer the young man who had fled a broken home. He was now the director of a home that offered comfort and companionship to those who needed it most. Every day, he dedicated himself to ensuring that the residents of the Walker House received the best care possible, not only in terms of medical attention, but also in terms of quality of life. David strove to create an environment where residents felt like part of a family. He organized activities, celebrations, and events that encouraged social interaction and the building of relationships between residents and staff. He also made sure that each resident had a voice in how the home was run, giving them a sense of belonging and control over their lives. But beyond the daily management, David also dedicated himself to learning from the residents. He listened to their stories, their memories, and their accumulated wisdom over the years. For David, each resident was a treasure trove of knowledge and experience, and he felt honored to be at their service at this stage of their lives. Mr. Walker's inheritance had not only changed David's life materially, it had transformed his way of seeing the world and his place in it. Through the creation of the Walker House, David discovered that the true value of an inheritance wasn't in the money or properties, but in what was done with them. Mr. Walker had left him more than a house. He had left him a legacy, a life mission that now defined him. David also realized that life wasn't just about surviving, but about finding a purpose that was bigger than oneself. For so long, he had lived only for the day-to-day, without thinking about the future or what he really wanted to achieve. But now, with the Walker House, he had something to live for, something that filled him with a sense of meaning and satisfaction. The money Mr. Walker had left him allowed him to maintain the home without immediate financial worries. But David also understood that he couldn't rely solely on that inheritance forever. He began to look for ways to make the Walker House self-sufficient, exploring funding options and donations that would allow him to continue offering high-quality services to the residents. As the Walker House flourished, so did David. The young man who had once arrived at Mr. Walker's house with fear and doubts was now a confident man with a clear vision of what he wanted to achieve in life. He had grown not only in terms of experience, but also in terms of emotional maturity and understanding of the world. David found in elder care a vocation he had never imagined having. The satisfaction he felt seeing the residents happy, knowing that he was making a difference in their lives, drove him to keep improving, to keep learning, and to keep expanding his vision. He knew that Mr. Walker would be proud of what he had achieved, and that gave him the strength to continue, even on the most difficult days. Additionally, David became a beloved figure in the community. The neighbors respected him for his dedication and commitment, and many of them began to see the Walker House as a model for what elder homes should be. Some even offered their time as volunteers, helping with activities and providing companionship to the residents. Over time, the Walker House became a well-known place in the region for its excellence in elder care. The waiting list to enter the home grew, and David began to think about the possibility of expanding, of opening new homes with the same principles that had made the Walker House a success. However, David knew that he didn't want to lose the personal touch that made the Walker House special. His focus was always on quality, not quantity, and he wanted to ensure that every new project he undertook maintained the same standards of care and dedication. As the home grew, David also began to think about his own personal future. Although he was completely dedicated to his work, he knew that there was more to life than just work. He began to open himself to the possibility of having a family of his own someday, of sharing his life with someone who understood and supported his vision. At the end of the day, when the bustle of the home quieted and the sun began to set, David often found himself in the garden, the same one he had worked on alongside Mr. Walker. He looked at the flowers they had planted together, now blooming in all their splendor, and felt a deep gratitude for the path he had walked. Mr. Walker was no longer there, but his legacy lived on in every corner of the Walker House. It lived on in the residents' laughter, in the stories they shared, and in the love and care that David and his team provided every day. And through this work, David had also found his own legacy, something that, in one way or another, would continue long after he was gone. Thus, the Walker House became more than just a home for the elderly. It became a symbol of the possibility of redemption, of transformation, and of the human capacity to find light even in the darkest moments. And as David continued his work, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing what he was destined to do. The story of David and Mr. Walker doesn't end here. It continues in every life touched by the Walker House. Through his dedication, David not only honored Mr. Walker's memory but also found his own reason for being, creating a legacy that will endure through time and continue to impact those who find refuge and love in that house. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories filled with emotion and life lessons. Leave us a comment below and tell us which part of the story moved you the most. We'd love to hear your opinion. And before you go, don't forget to watch the next story waiting for you on the screen. We're sure it will also reach your soul. See you in the next video.